And think about our website, tccsa.tc, not only for meetings, but for links. We have over 135 creation organizations linked. There are articles, debates, and much more. Chemist at Dow Chemical for 26 years. He's been doing creation ministry for 20 years. He has a number of books, has a radio program, and he's one of our most entertaining speakers.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm going to take up where I left off last year for just a second before I start talking about this whole monkey business idea. Last year I talked about geology and Mount St. Helens and the significance of all that and how it led to Darwin's theory of biological evolution. And since that time, as was said, I've been speaking and teaching on creation for about 20 years now. Ever since I became a Christian, I realized how important this was. And last year we took what I've been doing with a group of people who pray for it and guide the ministry, and we turned it into a nonprofit Christian charitable ministry. And we are coming out with a quarterly newsletter every quarter, 4 times a year. And along with the newsletter will come one of the radio CD sets. So there are actually 16 programs in each set. In each quarter, you'll receive 4 of the 15-minute programs along with the newsletter. And the first newsletter features what happened at Mount St. Helens. In the center of the newsletter, there's a full-page spread of the picture you see up here. I just feel like the Lord laid out the opportunity to take this picture of Mount St. Helens, which includes the mountain, the devastation of the flood flow below, how layered sediment forms, the trees that are floating on Spirit Lake that turned into coal seam, or could turn into a coal seam, how rapidly river valleys could be carved out. So all in one panorama, you can explain the geological evidence for creation and the impact of it all. And that's available over here in the smaller print. And there's a sign up for the larger print. But to get 5-foot prints like you see there, to make it affordable, I need to order 1,000 of them. So I need several hundred commitments before I can even order it. So I am going to pass around, just before I get the lecture started, a sign-up sheet for the newsletter. If you'd like to receive this newsletter 4 times a year, please sign up. And on the table, there's a sign-up sheet for the 5-foot Mount St. Helens print, should you desire to use that purely to teach others the significance of geology in trusting God's Word, and is a great tool for doing that. The last item I want to mention, and at the end I'll mention some of the resources I brought, is last Tuesday, with about a 3-day notice, I was asked to sit down with Dr. Kenneth Miller and have a debate on public TV radio. Turned out I thought it was radio, and I showed up in blue jeans and tennis shoes, and when I got there, they said, "Are you ready for the live TV show?" So right off the bat, I'm thrown off. But Dr. Miller is a PhD biologist. He speaks. He's called one of the top defenders of evolution in the country. He's written 3 public school biology books, speaks, teaches, writes extensively. He's written a book called Finding Darwin's God. Claims to be a Christian. He's a Catholic gentleman. But his whole drive in life is to prevent anything about intelligent design or creation from getting into public schools. So, I'm a chemical engineer by background, local person, basically a country Yahoo, who's coming up against this PhD chemist who's the country's leading defender of evolution. And it was 2 against 1 because the announcer was also an avid atheist, and they just tag teamed just the whole time, the whole hour. But I have DVDs here. They're free. Anybody that wants one and wants to see what you're up against as you go up against folks that are pushing evolution and trying to prevent the evidence for creation, you can get a feel for it, and feel free to grab one of those. So that's kind of just a few before I get started lists. And with that, I'm going to jump right on into the talk. But this is the panorama that, if you haven't already seen it, of Mount St. Helens. And over Christmas, we took this last November. God just opened up the door. I actually took this picture. It's a combined 2 digital photographs. The park ranger later said it was the clearest viewing day of Mount St. Helens he had seen in all of 2007, the day we happened to be there. And it wasn't, I think Lord just laid it out. And folks in my family who aren't Christians will just stop and stare at that picture. And I have a chance to say, that's a picture of sin, what sin will do to the world, because the whole world looked like that devastation after the worldwide flood. And it starts opening up conversations about geological change, what can happen in flood events, how river valleys have formed rapidly, how you get horizontal sediment layers, and etc. So, but this is what we're here to talk about today. From goo to you, by way of the zoo, as we look at our ancestor. Now, I think the majority of folks, if not all the folks here, are Christians. They know who Jesus Christ is. And in our churches, too often, we live in this Christian bubble where the people around us also acknowledge that. But what I am seeing in the culture around us is an incredible increase in the belief in atheism, and there is an incredible confusion about where this whole ape-man links, fossils, skulls fit into it all. Major organizations, all the way from Dobson to Chuck Colson to major denominations, somehow have this kind of confusing picture that, yeah, maybe there were these ancient humanoid-type creatures that they weren't quite human, but they weren't quite ape, and they really were out there somewhere. And how does that all fit into it? Or they have this idea that there's been enormous periods of time, and somehow something has been out there between man and ape, because there are all those skulls out there. And furthermore, probably the place you find it over and over again are the videos. This goes back to 91. I was on a radio debate with, once again, a leading evolutionist. By the way, I hate debates. I don't go seeking them out. I agonize over them. I'm not sure how much is accomplished by them, but when God plops them in your lap, you need to be obedient. And I was sitting just discussing the evidence for creation, and this John Cole, he's an anthropologist. He says, well, human evolution's a fact. Now, you've heard that over and over again in various ways. He says, all you got to do is line up the skulls. You just see this progression from a very small ape to a human. You just line up the skulls, and there they are. And I'm not an anthropologist, and I didn't really know how to answer that at that time. Or you hear this statement over and over and over and over again, ad infinitum. Human DNA is 98.5. I mean, think how accurate that sounds. It's right to the decimal point, identical to chimpanzee DNA. And then you get the names. Oh, my head spins with the names. By the way, I agonized over this lecture because you're going to see as we go along, it is complicated, even for the evolutionists. It's so complicated, and they give all these scientific names that sound so authoritative. The Homo habilises and the Homo erectuses and the Neanderthalenses and the Homo sapiens, and then there's the Homo sapiens sapiens, in case you don't have enough humanness in you. And you just line up all those names, and they tell the story. And the fact is, we face overwhelming odds trying to convince our culture that this is a myth, because it is coming at people from everywhere. And one of the things I like to do, because I think the media of today are the movies. That's where the young people of today are getting their view of reality. You know, a millennium ago, 1,000 years ago, it was storytelling. It was the passing on the stories of your ancestors to your children, who passed it to their children, who passed it to their children. 100 years ago, it was the books. You would read books to gain knowledge, and that's where you would get it. That's where you would decide what's true and what's not. Today's perceptions are set by cinema. They really are. That's what people sit around and discuss in colleges. That's where they get their idea of what's true and what's not true. So I'm going to throw in this montage. It's about 5 minutes long.
You're just in time. I have been trying to persuade George here of the modern scientific theories of Charles Darwin, the theory of evolution, the notion that all mankind is descended from the ape. He does not subscribe.
That's so. I do not. And I've ordered General Armstead to cease filling his head with such heathen blasphemies. Henceforth, sir, you ought to devote your reflective moments to studying matters of military significance.
Ordered me.
Surely the Commanding General shares my deep feelings of disgust at this simian suggestion.
Well, George, I suppose there's some pretty smart folk that take Darwin for the gospel.
They will not be invited to join George's ever-shrinking circle of friends.
So exactly how many of your relatives are there that are apes, George?
I found this in a limestone deposit dating back to the Devonian age.
I've never seen anything like that.
Exactly as I found it.
It's amazing. It's incredible. Could it possibly belong to a Pleistocene man?
Right, video 4.
All right, what's going on down there?
They've evolved into primates.
Oh, now that's a face for radio.
That DNA looks human.
No, it's not. It's missing the last pair of chromosomes, see? Close. The difference between man and ape is less than 3% genetic material. But that 3% gives you Einstein, Mozart.
Check the Ripper.
Way to explain what can't exist.
Talking monkeys can't exist.
Apes. Monkeys are further down the evolutionary ladder. Just above humans.
And guess what, Joe? 1,000,000 years ago, we wouldn't even have wheels for our trailer.
And we wouldn't even have a trailer, right, Gus?
Yeah.
And Gus, if it was that long ago, our brains would be smaller. We wouldn't even think about anything like that.
Man. So...
Tell me what's happening here.
Well, my sources are no longer fully annotated and my information is somewhat anecdotal. But I believe what was once one race is now two. One above and one below. Two distinct species that have evolved.
And how do those below survive?
That is the real question, isn't it?
A young world. A world early in the morning of time. A hard, unfriendly world. And man, superior to the creatures only in his cunning.
Hard to get grants for what I do. Most people just don't really believe it. They think it's a parlor trick, a gag. But it's no gag, ladies and gentlemen. And with this new technology, I can demonstrate it in a way in which it has never been possible to demonstrate it before. Animals can talk.
Because it is possible you are our descendants, Captain Kirk. 6,000 centuries ago, our vessels were colonizing this galaxy. Just as your own starships have now begun to explore that vastness. As you now leave your own seed on distant planets, so we left our seed behind us. Perhaps your own legends of an Adam and an Eve were two of our travelers.
Our beliefs and our studies indicate that life on our planet Earth evolved independently.
That wood candle.
Now, doesn't that just give you a warm, fuzzy feeling about where we came from? Just inspire you to go out and be better people. But all the way back to 1954. See, this hasn't just been a recent phenomenon. It's been going on for quite a while. And as you started to look at these movies and how they're convincing people, this is reality, this is fact, it's portrayed over and over and over again, I had the thought, well, I wonder how hard it's been pushed with time. Well, first, let's just take a look at some of these statements. You know, they went by fast, but I want to show you. They're on the movies, but think how often you're hearing them other places. Man's portrayed as just stupid and brutish and backward. They've evolved. We've evolved into primates. Or the difference between Mozart and apes is just 3% genetic material. Monkeys are further down the evolutionary ladder, just above humans. That long ago, our brains would have been smaller. Where there was once one race, we've now evolved into two distinct races. You're going to see that as we start to look at the ape-man lineage. Man superior to other creatures only in his cunning. There's no difference between man and other creatures. See, over and over again, it's conditioning people to think this way. Perhaps your legends of Adam and Eve were our travelers. No, we've evolved independently. And in that evolution icon, that lineage you saw in that one clip. Now, I went and I thought, how long has this been going on? And I hadn't seen anybody do this before. So I went to National Geographic, which has always been very evolutionary-minded, way back into the 20s, 30s, and on, and thought, I don't have time to go through all the magazines and all the articles, and it's enormous anyway, but how many times have they used the cover to push either ape man or evolution in general? I mean, it's just purely an evolution push on the cover. And I noticed the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, for those decades, there really was nothing on the cover to indicate that. Into the 60s, there was really nothing. From 60 to 70, there was one cover. And then it went from one cover to 5. Basically, every other year, there was a cover that featured ape-man type things or evolution in general. And then from the 80s to 90s, there was a little more than once every other year. From 90 to 2000, we're now at least once a year, the cover of National Geographic is pushing ape-man and evolution. From the year 2000 to 2010, we're now up to twice a year, the cover of the magazine is pushing ape-man or evolution. I thought, what's going on? I wonder if it's just National Geographic. So I went and did the same thing with Time magazine. There's the covers of Time magazine. 50s, 60s, almost nothing. 70s, a little bit. 80s to 90s, a little bit more. But all of a sudden, it's just taking off. Now, what's changed in our culture? I think what's changed is we have rounded the corner to where 30, 40 years ago, it was ridiculous to people to even think about that. It was just absurd. The majority of people were Christians. The majority of people realized this wasn't the truth. And the magazines knew they weren't going to sell. And there was nothing to be gained by pushing that as an agenda in the cover, on the covers of the magazines. But we're not there anymore. It's now a free-for-all. Atheist books are in the bestseller list, and the people who believe in biblical creation are on the decline in our culture, just as they were in Europe, 50, 60, 70 years ago. And that's what's happening. Now, here's a few of those covers, and while these fly by, I guess I want to just give you a little bit of my background. See, I got out of college totally believing in evolution, totally blind to the idea that anything else was true. And through a long series of circumstances, God got a hold of my life. I realized it was absolutely true what the Bible had to say. The only way to find atonement for sin, and I knew I was a sinner, was to accept what Christ had done. And he really had come as God on earth. But we still come with baggage. And a speaker was coming to our church to speak about creation. And I decided, well, I'll go see, this ought to be amusing. I love science, and creation was ridiculous, but I thought I would go listen. And there was a poster on the wall advertising this guy's talks that was coming. And I was standing there, and two ladies were discussing the poster in our church. And one of them said, can you believe anybody out there believes that apes turned into people? That's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. Now, that's all I had ever heard. I'd never heard anything different. I grew up in a Lutheran church, went through catechism. I never heard anything different. Never heard it contradicted. Never heard about a worldwide flood as the explanation for the fossil record. Never heard about any dating methods. Never heard about Noah's Ark as real. There's kind of a collection of it. Once again, just makes you feel good about yourself, doesn't it? And I'm thinking, well, those two are the missing links to believe that apes haven't turned into people. And here I am 20 years later giving the kind of lecture I heard that night. But the point is, we've got to get out of our churches. We've got to kind of take this kind of information and make a change, because we are losing this culture. It's on the rise, and we're losing. We're losing the publicity battle, and we've got to get the truth out there. Now, I'm going to start here. There have been a huge number of mistakes in this 150-year-old search for man's ancestors. Now, the idea that evolution's happened and apes have turned into people, it really does precede Darwin, but he kind of popularized it, and it became an intensive search from his time on. And over that time, lots of things have been proposed. The one that's the furthest back is, and the one you hear the most about, is Lucy. Not the furthest back in time, but the oldest supposed relative to man. Now, I'm not going to spend any time on Lucy at all. Lucy stood 3 foot tall, had a skull almost identical to apes with slight amounts of variation, and had a very controversial hip joint and knee joint that they say made her walk upright. Dr. David Minton has given this phenomenal hour-long talk on nothing but Lucy. If you want to know more about why that little ape wasn't a person, that's the DVD to get, and I'm just going to leave that alone. She simply was an ape. She was a little ape creature that was probably a variation of apes we have running around today. And after that time, there were jaw bones that were posed as links between man and ape. And there was a single tooth they found that turned out to be the tooth of a pig that turned out to not be even extinct, that was really popular during the Scopes monkey trial. But it dropped off the chart. Now, I'm going to spend almost no time talking about these mistakes, and I'm going to tell you why in a second. But I do want to camp on the next one for those who haven't heard this, and I know many of you have, but I bet there's some who haven't, and that's Piltdown Man. See, Piltdown Man was a jaw found in 1912 in Piltdown, England, that was very, very ape-like. And the teeth were kind of halfway in between humans and apes, and a skull, part of a skull was found that was very, very human-like. So they have a jaw that's very like an ape with a skull that's very like a human, and they're found together, and they're very ancient-looking. And they obviously were from the same thing. Now, here's all the top anthropologists of the day examining Piltdown Man. And there's a picture of Charles Darwin in the background overlooking the operation as the experts of the day are examining Piltdown Man. Now, for 40 years, this skull was in the London Academy of Sciences, and there were anthropologists who examined it. Over 300 PhD theses were written on this find. And from 1912 until 1952, for 40 years, should any student in a classroom come and say, I don't believe that ape-like creatures have turned into human beings, I believe God made human beings fully formed, he would be laughed out of the classroom. That's 2 generations of students, maybe 3, that raised their kids, and then those kids were raised. England, from 1912 to 1952, Christianity crumbled, and it became a non-Christian continent in those same time periods because there was evidence the Bible couldn't be trusted. It was right there in the museum, except it was a hoax. Turned out in 1952, someone outside the field of anthropology tried a new dating technique and found that skull and that jaw were completely different creatures from completely different time periods and could never possibly have went together. And they even realized after that was revealed, there were file marks on the teeth that were clearly file marks. Now, how do 300 people get their PhD theses written? Dozens of people examine these skulls, and they don't even see file marks on the teeth. It's because they're blinded by a preconception that evolution is a fact, Therefore, they can overlook the obvious, not dishonestly, but because of intellectual blindness based on their bias. Now, this is in textbooks, they'll talk about how science corrects itself. You see, science figured out the mistake and corrected itself. But it was someone outside of that paradigm, someone outside of paleoanthropology, the study of human fossils, who figured it out. The power of preconceptions is enormous, and that's the damage that's being done by these movies and the museums and the textbooks that only present the one viewpoint. So Piltdown Man was the hoax. Peking Man is in a classification along with Java Man, with one of the first fossils found, called Homo erectus. And these are skulls that frankly are smaller than most modern humans, and they're thicker, where they have eyebrow ridges, and they don't look as much like a normal modern skull as most of the skulls of people alive today. But I'm going to come back to Peking Man and Homo erectus Man in a little bit. Neanderthal, New Guinea, Cro-Magnon, those are just people. Their skulls look like people, they have cultures like people, they're just simply people. And then modern man. So lots of mistakes. Now, there was a time when I would spend half an hour or more just talking about how you can't trust all of these links between man and ape because all these mistakes have been made. And after spending the last few months studying this subject, I've decided that really is a mistaken approach. As we approach people or raise our children and then send them out into the culture and send them out to college, and all we've done is point out all the mistakes the evolutionists have made. Because any advancing knowledge is going to have mistakes. You're going to draw wrong conclusions, and then you learn from them and you go on. That's just the way science is. Now, some of these are blatant and they really shouldn't have been made, and they point out the misconceptions because evolution's assumed to be a fact, but still they're mistakes. Next, it doesn't explain legitimate fossils that are out there. And we're going to talk about how many there are in a second. I was blown away when I realized how many ape-man type fossils are out there. And third, it's insulting. It's insulting to say just because someone made a mistake, you can never trust anything they ever say again. And it's also poor logic. That doesn't prove anything. So I spent a little bit talking about these mistakes that have been made in the past because they're revealing that if folks have been fooled by wrong things in the past, they're probably likely to be fooled by the wrong conclusions in the future. But I don't want that to be the whole story or people to take that away as the whole story. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is recommend this book, because a large part of this lecture came out of Martin Lubnau's book, The Bones of Contention. This man has spent his life studying human to ape fossils. He is the renowned expert from a biblical viewpoint on what's out there. Now, if you know anybody who's going into anthropology or going to college to study fossils or bones or paleoanthropology or archaeology, invest $15 in their lives and get them this book. It's got tons of technical information, enormous amounts of factual documentation. It lays out the fossils in ways no evolutionary book does, and it shows what they're not going to get in their classes and museums. And it's likely to save their faith. It's going to have an internal impact on many young people if you'll get it into their hands and encourage them to read it. So if you're writing down lists of resources, that's a book that needs to get into young people's hands if they're going into any of these type of fields. Now, here's the problem as we approach this whole issue. Very, very few people, including myself, have a background in paleoanthropology. That's the study of human fossils. I'm not an expert, and very few people in this room and very few people in our culture are. It's a very select group of people. And the interpretations that come in this field of study come with a bias. And that bias is evolution is a fact. You heard it on the video clips and you hear it all the time. The people in this field absolutely believe that something turned into a human being. Because there are only two possibilities. Either human beings are here because they were created fully formed, fully functional, with intelligence, with all sorts of intellectual abilities, or something else turned into human beings. These folks reject the first option, therefore the second option has to be true. That's their mindset. That's the filter through which they interpret everything they find. Second problem, and this is Martin Lubnau's words, and he's an expert in this who's studied it for 20 or 30 years. The fossils are unbelievably confusing because there are so many of them and there's so many varieties there. Now, what I'm going to do tonight is simplify it, and the folks who get this DVD that are evolutionists, they're probably going to turn livid as I simplify what they're out there doing, and I believe they purposely try to make incredibly complicated. But we'll see how I do. Third, there really are little or no access to the actual fossils. In 1984, I believe that's the date, they had a Ancestor show in New York City where they brought the leading major ape-to-human fossils all together for one show. Now, these fossils are locked up like the royal crown jewels of England, and very few people, including these paleoanthropologists, ever get to see the actual fossils. But they've made casts of them. So using these casts, they made beautiful little velvet-covered pedestals for each of our ancestors' bones, so people could walk by and see them in a cathedral-like setting. Well, it turns out when the actual bones arrived, based on the plaster casts, they didn't even fit into the pedestals. And yet it's the casts that are being used to draw all the conclusions about these fossils. The experts, by and large, don't even get to see them. And last, there is this incredible propaganda assault. So voices to the contrary don't even get heard. They're just drowned out by the constant drumbeat of apes that turned into people. Therefore, human evolution is simply accepted. And sadly, it's accepted by most church denominations. They just kind of blend it in and say God used evolution. Now, here's the classic view. And you saw that in that one chart, the one video clip called Congo, where the guy says, animals can speak, and behind him is this icon of evolution. An icon is something that's used to cement a concept into people's minds. And that's the concept that little ape-like creatures have turned into bigger ape-like creatures, that turned into more upright ape-like creatures, that have turned into people-like creatures that have ape-like faces, that have turned into Neanderthal-type people that have more tool-using ability that eventually turned into modern man. And you see that kind of thing everywhere. Now, try to hang on to these names. And I realize they're kind of scientific and kind of hard to pronounce. But these are the major groupings that are still used. You got the Australopithecines. That's Lucy. That's the little 3-foot-tall chimp that's just a variation of some sort of a monkey or an ape. You have Homo habilis. Now, he's kind of controversial, and some evolutionists accept him, and some don't, and some add extra names to him and throw people into that category, and some don't. But he's kind of a bigger ape kind of creature, for the most part. A little bit bigger skull, a little bit bigger than Lucy. Then you have the major category where all sorts of fossils fit into this, called Homo erectus. And we're going to talk more about him as we move along. Then you have Homo neanderthalis. And finally, you have modern man, Homo sapiens. So those are kind of the 5 major categories that are still used by evolutionists very extensively. Now, this was something that surprised me, and I've actually heard this and I've used these same quotes many times. Here is an expert in evolution in Science magazine in 1984. He makes this statement: in all of the world, there are only a few dozen bones of our ancestors. But these few fossils attest to the evolutionary odyssey that created the human species. That's the same sort of thing that John Cole said in 1991 in a debate with me. There's a evolutionary odyssey and the bones attest to it. But he says there's only a few of these bones out there. Here's another one. John Reeder, New Scientist, he said the entire hominid collection, you'll see that word again, hominid just means human-like. The entire human-like collection known today would barely cover a billiard table. And one more, the primary scientific evidence is pitifully small array of bones to construct man's history. Why, one anthropologist compared reconstructing the ape to man lineage like in writing the entire War and Peace book with 13 pages. See, quote after quote after quote. These are in the early 80s, 1984, that say, yeah, there's just not many bones out there. We know it happened, but there's not many bones out there. Now, here's the surprise. The fossil record is huge for human-like fossils. There was this catalog of fossil hominids published in 1977. Now, this is 5 to 10 years before those quotes were made, okay? So these people were aware of this catalog. It's 3 books, each of them hundreds and hundreds of pages long, that list all of the fossils of things that have been found in the ground that are human-like and supposedly really, really old. In 1976, Martin Lubnow said he went through the book and listed 4,000 fossils had been found that fell somewhere between man and ape. 4,000 of them. But those quotes said there weren't hardly any. They'd barely cover a billiard table. From 1977 to 2007, it's been estimated that there's been another 4,000 fossils found. There's tons of them out there. So why are these people saying there's hardly anything available? Well, here's Mr. Evolutionist, and this is what he's saying. The primary scientific evidence is a pitifully small array of bones from which to construct man's evolutionary history. You see, that's the words, but it needs to be interpreted by his preconception. What he is actually saying or thinking is, he says that, but he means this. Well, there's lots of bones out there, but they're either too modern to help me, or they don't fit into the evolutionary scheme that I know to be true. See, that's what the words mean when he says the words. It's not that there aren't lots of bones. He just can't use the ones that are out there to fit what he knows to be true. See, here's a display from the Smithsonian Institute. Lots and lots of bones. Lots and lots of skull shapes. Many of them are just pieces that have been pieced together. The line in between probably separates the ones that are very, very ape-like from the ones that are very, very human-like. They have many missing pieces, and there's an enormous amount of interpretation and disagreement of what they represent and where they fit and whether they were in the line to humans or whether they weren't, even amongst the experts. And there's lots of similarity between the variations. Here's another chart, and this is very similar to one that was in National Geographic in the early 2000s. But you have the chimp-like, remember Lucy, the Australopithecines down here. Remember, these are the names I mentioned. Here's more Australopithecines and these folks are very similar to Australopithecines. These are considered Homo habilis types. So, and then you've got the Homo erectus, and then you got modern humans. And Neanderthal has been downgraded by the evolutionary community. He's no longer considered in the line to man. He's now considered a branch that branched off. But the point of this chart is, look at the question marks. 13 different question marks in this whole story of what happened there. Missing pieces after missing pieces after missing pieces. It's not at all straightforward and clear. Basically, I'm going to go on and talk about why this is true, but the apes are on the right side, including down here, and the human beings are on the left side, and these dates are just made up to match based on mistakes in dating techniques. Now, once again, another chart, very, very recent chart, ape-like creatures, Australopithecines, 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 and so on, somehow turned into Homo erectuses, that these ones went extinct, the Southern Asia Homo erectuses went extinct, the Homo erectuses from Africa all went extinct, but the Homo erectuses that settled in Europe and came out of Africa went on to survive and became us. About, 200,000 years ago they turned into us, and 40,000 years ago they became really, really human. And Neanderthals just kind of hanging out there. So that's the latest set. Very confusing, lots of varieties, like bushes of people that popped up all over the place. Well, what are these Homo erectuses? Well, this is how Martin Lubnow goes about teaching his students. Every time he gets a group of students in at his college, he divides them into groups. He'll maybe put 10 groups in a student, and he'll give those 10 students 5 of these ape-man skulls, usually the very classic, totally supported skulls by the evolutionary community. And these are his rules. You take those skulls, Homo erectus or Australopithecines or whatever, and you have to spend 8 hours reading all of the references about each of those skulls. You have to find 5 different resources for each skull, and you're not allowed to use anything written by any creationist. It has to be documented by evolutionists. You have to document the dates for those skulls from those sources, how old they are when they were found and when they were supposedly lived and evolved. And then he would give them skulls from these different groupings. And then you have to give a report on it to the class. So you spent 5 skulls, 8 hours each. You spent 40 hours studying these. Now report what you found. According to Lubnow, every single time he's done that, it results in a falsification of the idea that evolution has happened, simply by studying the skulls and allowing the students to compare the different skulls and what's said about them from different sources. So how do you falsify something? You see, if there isn't a way to show something is false, then it's a dogma, it's a religion, it's not science. There's got to be a way to show it's false or not, or it's not science. Well, I think there's really only 2 main ways. If you show that modern human beings have lived way down deep into the rock record at the same time as our supposed ancestors were alive, then the ancestors couldn't have turned into us because we were alive at the same time as our ancestors, our supposed ancestors. That falsifies the whole idea of evolution. Or second, if you find very, very ape-like people alive very recently at the same time as modern man, then evolution couldn't have happened. Because you see, evolution says one kind of creature changes by mutations and it has some sort of a beneficial effect, and then it's more well adapted to its environment. It's better able to survive than what it came from. So what it came from, if it's living in exactly the same environment in exactly the same area, they're going to continue to interbreed, and the advantage isn't going to ever take place. It's not going to continue to evolve upward. So if you have 2 groups of animals that are identical, living in the same environment, and they don't separate, if the less evolved one never disappears, you can't have upward advancing evolution happening. So if the ancient creatures are alive at the same time as the new creatures, right up into modern times, they can't be our ancestors either. So if these things are true, then how do the evolutionists keep the faith? If these finds are happening, what are the evolutionists going to say? Well, first of all, to keep their faith in evolution, if either number 1 or number 2 are found, they have to deny that those things found were really human in ancient rocks. That's what they have to do. Otherwise, they know evolution isn't true. That's one strategy. Or, if you find a very ape-like thing way up high in the rock record, you have to deny that you have to claim the ape-like hominoid is actually a human being. And then it couldn't be our ancestor either. Or you have to change the dates so the fossils fit. Now I'm just going to give one example, 1 or 2 quick examples of each of these to give you a feel for what's going on out there. Well, to understand what's going on, you've got to understand the incredible variety God built into life. I mean, if you look at dogs, you get everything from a Chihuahua to a Wolfhound, to a German Shepherd to a St. Bernard, a Dalmatian to an Irish Setter. It's a huge difference in skull shape and size and abilities of each of those different creatures, all from a basic mongrel mutt dog type. Well, people show an enormous amount of variety too, but you don't hear a lot about it. It's not publicized. See, the modern human skull ranges all the way from 700 cc's to 2200 cc's. There's an enormous variety. And the size of our skull has nothing to do with our intelligence. And just to demonstrate that, the average male brain is 1400 cc's in volume, and the average female brain is 1300 cc's in volume. Now, anybody that wants to argue that a larger brain makes you smarter is in big trouble with their wives. It simply isn't true. We're not wired that way. The brain size has nothing to do with it. And skull shape varies fairly widely among the human beings. And it can be changed by things like Eskimos who chew upon leather and blubber and things all their lives from they're very young. They can actually change the shape of their jaw and their skull by those kind of activities. How do we know the skulls we found in the fossil record, those kind of things weren't going on? Furthermore, what anthropologists use to distinguish man, when they dig stuff up, if they find tools, they'll look at this kind of tools and they'll say, well, they were fully human or they weren't fully human based on their tools. Were they advanced? Were they bone? Were they whatever? Well, that's kind of dependent on whether they've reverted. An example of this is the Tasmanian Aborigines. In 1820, England moved onto a little island called Tasmania off of Australia, and they found native people, this is 1820, with incredibly coal black skin, deep set eyes, and they were described as having ridges over their eyebrows. Okay? They were considered at that time a throwback from human beings. 5,000 of them were found on the island, and from 1820 to 1880, they were wiped out. They were hunted down like animals. They were castrated like sheep. They were herded up into pens and used for target practice. They were stuffed and sent back to England for examination. The entire culture was wiped out because they had no technology. They didn't use tools for the most part. They didn't seem to have any belief in God. Their language wasn't understood. They had no trade or commerce. They slept in groups in the open, just on the ground, and they were just considered non-human beings. The only Tasmanian Aborigines left alive today were those who intermarried with the British who colonized that island, which means they were interfertile with human beings, which means they were human beings. Absolute proof. But the culture itself was wiped out based on ideas of evolution that were developing at the time. First strategy to deny that the bones that are being found, part of those 4,000 bones that are out there, are really just human beings. That have went all the way down in the fossil record. The evolutionists give numbers to many of these bones. One of them's KNMER 1470. It's a really famous skull that was found by Richard Leakey in 1972. But right along in the same rock sediment, he found this other bone that was a human leg bone identical to a modern human leg bone. So he's got this skull, and he's got a bone that's identical to a modern human leg bone in the same area. Now, this was someone that was with Richard Leakey at the time when he found this skull. And this guy says, well, you can take those bone fragments that we found of the skull, and you can kind of push them in, and you can give them essentially a modern human face. Or you can kind of pull the bone fragments out, and you can give it this elongated ape-looking face. And how you reconstruct the bones depends on your preconception and your bias. That's what kind of thing that goes on. Now, this skull had a 600 or an 800 cc skull capacity. That's right within the human modern variation. The trouble is the rock layer that it was found in has been assumed by misinterpreted dating methods to be almost 2 million years old, and there couldn't be any human beings around 2 million years ago, so it's called an ape-man link. It can be reconstructed to look like a human. Its skull capacity fits within the human variation, and it was found with other bones that look fully human, and yet it's assumed to be a Homo erectus, a link between man and ape. So it's been classified as non-human. Here's another example. The Lakatole footprint trail was found by Mary Leakey in 1978. Now here's a picture out of National Geographic of those footprints. They look exactly like a modern man who has walked barefoot all his life, in which case your toes tend to spread out and you don't see distinct toe prints. But there's not a really elongated second toe like any sort of an ape-like creature has. It's a modern human footprint. She said, wow, those footprints are remarkably similar to modern man. Russell Tuttle studied them for over a year, and he compared them with footprints made by Indians down in South America that walked barefoot all their lives. And he said these footprints are indistinguishable from habitually barefoot man, modern man, Homo sapiens. So they look like modern people's footprints. They taste like modern people's footprints. They are exactly like modern people's footprints, but they're found in rock that's been dated 3.5 million years old, so they stuck an Australopithecine in the picture and say they were made by that creature, which doesn't have feet anything like that. You see, there is all sorts of evidence that modern man has lived way far down in the rock record, right alongside his supposed ancestors, but it's just denied. It's reclassified as not human. Here's our Professor Evolution again. This is what he says. There are no human bones in the ancient rocks containing our ape-like ancestors. You don't find any bones of humans way down there. I've been told that to my face. But this is what he's really thinking. Well, although we've found bones that look just like human bones, since evolution is a fact, they really must not be human bones. See, the evidence doesn't drive the conclusion. The presupposition drives the interpretation of the evidence. That's what's going on. And it's going on with a straight face. You know, there have been lots and lots of skulls found in both old and new sediment. They're often associated with tools. They've been found in rocks dated all the way from 3.5 million years up to 6,000 years ago. Here's some of those skulls that have been found. You know, and these are the complete ones that we can measure skull capacity. We've found modern human beings with 1,500 cc's all the way down to Homo erectus individuals with 869, 900,000, 1,200 cc's of skull capacity within the variation of current people living on this planet, found all the way down through the rock record. It's there. This is what Lubnau's students find when they go out and study it, but you won't hear it in the textbooks. Okay, excuse number 2. Well, what do they do when they find recent ape-like fossils right up in modern times? You see, in Australia, in a place called the Cow Swamp, and in another location called the Cossack, and then in other locations anywhere from the 60s up into the 70s, they've found bones that look very, very much like these Homo erectus ape-like creatures. The ones they're claiming lived 2-3 million years ago, we're finding in sediment we know has to be less than 10,000 years old, 6,000 or so years old. They've been dated that way. They're acknowledged to be that way. They live in very close contemporary locations with totally modern human kind of skulls. Okay? They've got these eyebrow ridges, and they've got the sloping forehead, and they've got the big jaws and the thick bones. Well, in 1972, after some of these finds were found, the evolutionists wrote several articles in Nature magazine, and they said, well, these individuals, they had genetic differences. They're fully human because obviously we found them recently, but they had genetic differences, or they had nutritional deficiencies, or they had some sort of diseases, or they used their jaws in ways that modern humans on other locations weren't. But, you know, they really are fully human beings. So they look like the Homo erectuses, but they're not the Homo erectuses. Well, if that explains how modern, fully human people look like Homo erectus, how do we know the Homo erectuses from way back then weren't modern human beings? You see the quandary they're in? All sorts of problems. Once again, here's Professor Evolution. What he says is, why man descended from Homo erectus ancestors 200,000 years ago and became fully human. That's the party line. And you'll read it and hear about it everywhere. And the churches, the Catholic Church and the Presbyterian Church and the Methodist Church, and even some of the Lutheran denominations, they just buy right into it, and they assume because the expert Mr. Evolution says it, it must be true, and you got to shoe fit it into the Bible somehow. Well, this is what he means. Evolution is a fact. So when you find these Homo erectus features in young fossils, it must be variations of people. And when you find Homo erectus features in old fossils, why, then it's our ancestor. See, he says it with a straight face. Because there's all sorts of confusion out there, and I'm not even sure all of them realize what they're saying. And then you can change the dates if nothing else works. Here's Rhodesian Man. He was found in 1921. His skull was remarkably fresh. It was not fossilized. It's just bone, okay? Found in 1921 in Rhodesia. It was more modern in appearance than Neanderthal man. Okay? So found, not fossilized, less eyebrow ridges and less thicker bones and so on. Just a modern human skull found in 1921 down in Africa. It was associated with very modern looking bones. It was found with other animal bones that were also quite modern, some that have now been extinct, but there was a variety found with him. And they found bone tools with him that were even more useful and modern than Neanderthal uses. So they dated him at 11,000 years based on all these different things back in 1921. During the Ice Age, they said he lived, except he was in Africa. Here's a picture of him I found on the internet. Well, in 1962, they radiocarbon dated him and decided, well, radiocarbon dating came in, he must be 40,000 years old. There's a really good 1-hour DVD on why radiocarbon radiometric dating method are giving us the wrong dates that I'd recommend if you haven't seen it. 1975, they upped him to 125,000 years old because they said extinct animals had been found with him. Tools that he were using were also being used by fossil ancient men that they found. They were similar and they needed to line him up with other men. And they had to put him in the right sequence of evolutionary folks. And in 1999, they upped him to 400,000 years old because of the need to move this Homo erectus skull out of the direct lineage to man. Because people supposedly became fully human in 200,000 years old, and he didn't fit. So it wasn't based on the skull. It wasn't based on the skull characteristics. It wasn't based on what they found with him. They simply arbitrarily decided to move the date when they found him. This poor guy aged 385,000 years in a mere 78 years. You know, it's done. It's just being done out there. Mr. Evolutionist says, radiometric dating techniques provide us with absolute methods for dating fossil remains. What he means is, well, unless they agree with the evolutionary sequence, in which case we know they're inaccurate and they're thrown out. That does go on. There are many examples of it. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here with this part. Australopithecines, they're simply apes. They are just variations of apes, like there's variations of dogs, like there's variations of people. And we dig down in the rock record and we find different shapes and sizes of them. Homo habilis, he's just a little bit bigger variation of some sort of ape. Homo erectus, from my reading, and I may be wrong, but from my reading, almost all of them fall right into the variation of human beings today. They had slightly different shaped skulls. If they were still around today, they would be considered a different race of human beings. And they were just simply people. This is just an artist's conception to make it look like an ape. But it's just a variation of human beings because you got to have something in between that's being thrown in between. And then there's modern humans. I think what we've got out there are apes and we've got humans. And there's lots of variations of both. Last subject before I wrap up that really needs to be put to bed because it's so popularized. We're told we're 98, 97, 96%, 99% identical to chimpanzees. Now, this statement was popularized in the 1970s long before human DNA was ever mapped. See, we didn't map human DNA with this huge worldwide project until about 2003. That's when human DNA was mapped. So how did they know we're 98.5% identical to apes when we haven't even mapped the code upon our DNA? You see, they just mapped a single letter of the DNA code and drew that conclusion based on a single letter. And it doesn't consider the DNA where the information is missing. You see, there was a whole bunch of DNA that's called junk DNA that doesn't seem to contain a lot of information. Now that's shrinking and shrinking and shrinking with time because we're finding out all of this stuff causes things to happen within our body and has a useful purpose. But they didn't consider where there was sections of the DNA missing that weren't in the ape DNA. They just ignored that. Now that's like comparing an elephant and a tiger and saying, an elephant is 98.5% identical to a tiger if you don't consider the fact that the elephant has a trunk and the tiger has stripes. That's what you're doing. You're not considering the huge missing differences, and then you're saying they're identical. Or that's like saying a Volkswagen's 98% identical to our Mercedes because they both have steering wheels and they both have tires and they both have paint and they both have engines and they both have pistons and they both use gasoline. They're 98.5% identical. But you see, they were both designed by an intelligent designer to serve a similar function in an environment. Okay, but in spite of even those blatant mistakes, the same person who popularized that 98.5% figure is now saying we're only 94.5% similar, and we've totally mapped the mouse DNA in late 2002. Here's two quotes after we figured out what the DNA structure of a mouse looks like. Remember, we use mice for medical testing because their metabolism is so similar to human beings. Turns out the two genomes, that's our entire genetic structure, of a mouse is 99% similar to the human counterparts. Here's another quote. What's the difference between Stuart Little and William Shakespeare? Only 300 genes out of 30,000 genes. That's 1%. You see, next time you hear someone say, apes are 99% similar to human beings, say, no, that's not true. They're only 94%. And we now know that a mouse is 99% identical to a human being. We actually evolved from a mouse, not an ape. See, there are so, of mice and men was the comment. There is so much we don't know about the DNA structure. The human DNA contains 4 billion letters. That's like a stack of books from here to the ceiling. But it can't explain all the complexity of the human body. We're now finding out that it's the 3-dimensional structure of DNA that also carries information. It's like taking a letter from page 1 and combining it with a letter from page 20 and combining it with a letter from page 8,000 and finding useful information across that 3-dimensional structure in addition to the straight reading a book like we would do. It is so complex. We're like babies trying to comprehend Einstein's equations as we look at what the DNA combined involves. Okay. Now, this is where I'm going to end up. This whole creation issue is really an issue of answering the questions people are asking. You know, the first question everybody has to have an answer to is, where did we come from? Christianity and biblical creation has a very clear, scientifically consistent answer to that question. We were created separately and differently from other biological creatures. And there are groupings of biological creatures that haven't turned into other creatures. Then where does death and problems come from? Biblical Christianity says God created things to live for eternity in peace, in harmony, but mankind spit in God's face and said, I don't want you making the rules. I want to make the rules. I want to do what I want to do. In essence, I want to be God. God can't tolerate that. He cursed, he changed all of creation to deteriorate downwards so we wouldn't live forever in his absence. So how do you fix what's wrong with the world? Well, what's wrong with the world is the sin in every human heart. What's wrong with the world starts in the fracture that every one of us have in our heart. And we can't fix our hearts. We have to have a new heart. It has to be replaced by what God has done. We can only find hope and redemption through what he has done for us, not by making ourselves better people. And what's the purpose in life? It's really to serve our Creator and to find out what he's made us to do, and then to go and do those things. And that's where we find satisfaction. My contention is if you get the first question wrong, everything else falls apart, and you will answer all the other questions wrong, and you will ultimately live a frustrated life. And this is how I'm going to illustrate that as I wrap up. You know, biblical Christianity, the worldview starts with not just creation, but a recent creation that makes it a relevant creation. Well, if that's true, if that foundational block is true, if that domino is correct, then there really wasn't anything before mankind. You know, one conclusion leads directly to the next. Well, if there was really nothing before mankind, that leads into what we're talking about today. Then Adam really was a real person. That's a real historical fact. And where does death come from? It doesn't come because it's always been around, because these ape-like creatures have slowly evolved, because there's always been death and disease and destruction. It comes about because of Adam's sin. And that leads directly to the conclusion it wasn't God that just made things that way. God isn't responsible for death. Mankind is. Which leads to a great trust in the Bible as true history. And if the Bible is true about biology, and the Bible is true about geology, and the Bible is true about where the whole cosmos comes from, then it's trustworthy on moral issues and how we should live and how we should treat other people and what's going to happen after death and so on. But look what the world has done. Satan is incredible. He's a genius. We can't stand against him without Christ in his mind. You see, if he would have attacked the Bible as totally untrue back 100, 150 years ago and irrelevant, people wouldn't have listened. They wouldn't have fallen for it. If he'd have said Adam and Eve never existed in the 1800s, people would have never fallen for it. They never would have believed it if the scientific community started there. But if we just simply say, we've got all sorts of dating methods that aren't accurate. If we look at geology and there's never been a worldwide flood and we can see all these sediment layers and they're really, really old, then what you've done is destroy the belief in a recent creation. Now follow the logic stream. All you have to do is destroy the belief in a recent creation. Now you got all of these fossils. You got these ape-like fossils that are found really deep in this sediment. They must be really old because the dating methods are accurate. We believe the dating methods. Therefore, these ape-like humanoid creatures must have been around before Adam. Where do you fit Adam into it? Well, that means there really was something before mankind. Well, then Adam wasn't a real person, was he? I've talked to many, many Christians and many, many Hugh Rosses and other type believers. They can never tell me where to fit Adam and Eve into their sequence of believing in an old earth. They can't figure out where to put him. So they just ignore the issue. Well, therefore, guess what's always been around? Death has always been around. Because you can look. You got all these fossils, and you got these humanoid creatures, and you got these old bones and these old skulls. And obviously they've lived and died of diseases. So it wasn't Adam that caused it because he didn't exist. Death has just always been around. Well, then who caused death? It must be God. Even if you still believe in God, if death's always been around, then God's the one who caused death. And you certainly can't believe in a literal creation, and you can't believe in a worldwide flood, and you can't believe that man's sin caused death. As a matter of fact, you can't believe the Bible about much of anything. So why trust the Bible at all? You see, you started clear back here, and everything else falls. It just wipes it all out because you've accepted the dating techniques that age these ancient fossil men as really, really old. And then you can't figure out where to put Adam, and you can't figure out where death entered into it all. And all of a sudden, all of the Bible becomes unbelievable. From just because you accepted this very beginning domino, once it falls, all the rest of it falls. It may take a generation, it may take 2 generations, but eventually the culture becomes non-Christian. See, that's why this issue is so important. It destroys the entire Christian worldview when you don't get the first domino right. Okay, so hang on. Next. Okay. Now, what I'm doing, and I'm going to wrap up with questions, I do want to talk about what's on the table. First, there's a devotional. We developed a devotional with a couple science teachers. Talks about, in 365 days of the year, how you can trust God's Word from 26 different areas of science. My book are one-page articles that come with a disc in the back with all the text and all the articles and permission to reproduce them in church newsletters and newspapers, and that's the way it's been used. The radio show are 15-minute talks blended with music at the beginning and the end about all these different subjects that deal with creation and a Christian worldview. And as I said, you'll get volume 4 if you sign up for the newsletter and support the ministry. And by the way, Search for the Truth Ministry, our vision is to change to bring people to biblical truth, change their minds and hearts with biblical truth. And we're going to do it by giving away 1 million of these resources, getting them into students' hands, giving them away on college campuses, giving them to chaplains who take them into prisons. And as the money comes in, it's all going to be put back into books that will be given away. So that's the vision of the ministry, is to get this truth out there. The green set contains the PowerPoints and the audios of these 1-hour lectures I've been giving. And then there's a series of DVDs of the different talks. So those are resources that you can then go and use and hopefully help change the culture. But this whole ape man thing is so important. And it's a great tool because if you can get people to realize, well, people kind of want to believe they're special and they didn't come from apes somehow. And you get them to realize, well, you realize that if there have been all these ape-type creatures, then God's the one who just created death and disease. They start thinking. It starts opening their eyes, and it leads to discussions about where these skulls come from. Okay, so that was my wrap-up. Yes?
Just a point, you're missing a key movie, 10,000 years BC with Raquel Welch.
Actually,
Super intelligent design.
that was 1 billion years BC, and it was there. And that's the one where they grunt the whole movie. I think. I only watched about 10 minutes and I skipped ahead and they were still grunting, and I went to the end and they were still grunting. So, yeah, well, this is a Christian family.
They aged those bones up to 400,000 years, and they just tripled the age of the Grand Canyon. I don't know if you saw that recently.
No, I hadn't seen it. The comment was they've tripled the age of the Grand Canyon. These dates are fluid. That's what I will say. Evolution is the framework through which the folks who are viewing the world, but you've got to realize science has been defined as finding the naturalistic explanation for the world around us, by definition. It's what John Sanford, who wrote a book called Genetic Entropy, says there's a prime axiom of science that can never, ever be violated, and that is you have to explain everything by natural causes. So no matter how much evidence there is, no matter how many other dating techniques there are, no matter how many problems there are, you can only, in a scientific classroom and in our schools nowadays, explain things as if God has never been involved. Well, that's not searching for the truth, but that is what's going on. And who's going to make a difference? Who is going to do anything other than that? You know, expecting a non-Christian or someone who doesn't believe the Bible, even if they claim to be a Christian, to explain the reality of what's happened is like expecting a blind man to see. It's our job. It's our job as Christians to go and look at the world from God's Word and use that as our framework and then explain it to others. And I think we've not done a very good job at doing it, and that's why we're in the shape we're in as a culture. And that's why this organization is so important, and it needs to be supported. Yes?
Bruce, I have just a kind of a two-pronged question here. How old is the Earth, and what is your dating technique?
I believe, and it is a belief, because you can't prove how old something is. I spent an hour on a DV talking about how dating techniques work. I believe the Earth is in the 6,000 year range. I believe the Bible is to be understood in a straightforward way. There are possibilities of missing generations. We can't pin it down to an exact date. Now, scientifically, what are my dating techniques? Let me give you three. One, and these are fairly recent findings from the Institute for Creation Research. All over this planet, we find granite, which has zircon crystals in it. Inside of all these zircon crystals, we find radioactive decay has happened. We can look at the elements and we know how much, for instance, uranium used to be there. We know how much lead has resulted, and we know the reaction, how much helium has been kicked out by these radioactive decay processes. So we know the radioactive decay has happened. without a doubt. Up until a few years ago, about 6 years ago, no one had bothered to measure how fast does that helium come out of those zircon crystals. In essence, what you have inside of all these rock layers all over the Earth are little itsy-bitsy teeny helium balloons. It's it's a thick-walled balloon with zircon instead of latex, but it's like helium trapped inside of a little balloon. When they measured the permeation rate of that helium coming out, and they've done it at multiple layers, in multiple temperature, in multiple locations, they found out you can divide the amount of helium left by the rate at which it leaves, and that radioactive decay had to have happened within the last 6,000 years, or that helium couldn't possibly still be there. That is incredible evidence that that granite formed within the last 6,000 years all over this planet. Second, they have found radiocarbon still present in levels 100 to 500 times the detectable limit in every biological organism that's ever been alive on this planet. You see, half of every bit of radiocarbon, once you stop eating and stop taking in radioactive carbon-14, it stops building up in a dead organism, and it starts decaying. And every 5,700 years, half of it's gone. So 10,000, or about 11,000 years ago, you're down to a fourth of it. And 15,000 years ago, you're down to an eighth of it, and so on. You're cutting it in half, cutting it in half, cutting it in half. After about 100,000 years, there's no detectable amount should be left. And after 200,000 years, there shouldn't even be an atom of radioactive carbon left in something that used to be alive. And yet we find coal seams that are supposedly 100 million years old that still have 100 times more measurable radioactive carbon than should be there. It's an enormous evidence that this Earth is quite young. Third, or fourth, the genetic buildup on our DNA molecules is happening at an enormous rate. Our genetic code is like a book. It's like an enormous encyclopedia. Well, let's take a cockroach. Just take a cockroach, for instance. It's supposedly been around 1 billion years, and they probably have at least 3 generations per year. And it has a genetic code. Well, if you take the genetic code of a cockroach and then you randomly change a few letters, it's probably not going to cause that cockroach to die or deteriorate it. You understand? It's like taking a book and randomly changing 10 letters, a physics book. Well, then you take that book and you randomly change 10 more letters. It's still a very functional book. But then you take that book with 20 little random changes and you randomly change 10 more. That's mutations. And it's happening on every living organism. Well, after not very long, not after millions and billions of years, after thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, you've reduced the useful code to gobbledygook in that book, the same way it's happening in molecules. That's an evidence that the code in every living organism couldn't be millions of years old. It has to have been created quite recently. So there's 4 different evidences that have convinced me this Earth is quite young. And there are more, but those just stick out. Okay. Yes?
Pre-flood, they found evidence of all these large skeletons around. And I know they have this picture of this evolution of man small going, bigger. But how come all these that they find 9, 10, 12 feet tall down in coal mines?
Yeah, well, there was an enormous variety on this planet. There's been a couple step changes in our entire understanding of creation. One of them was the fall. We know essentially nothing about what this entire universe was like before the fall of Adam. I'm going to speculate. I think there's probably instant regeneration of cells. I think there was absolutely perfect transfer of information from one molecule and cell to the next, and so on. I think there was an enormous variety of creatures in the ocean because most of the extinct creatures we find are creatures that used to live in the ocean and they went extinct. And I've read that 90% of the creatures that used to be alive on this planet are now extinct. Now, some of those are just varieties of current creatures, but others aren't. The question was, what about all these giant creatures we've seen, including large human beings? The Bible talks about Goliath. It talks about giants that were alive. Now, this goes back when Israel was moving in after Moses into Egypt. That's probably in the 3,000 year ago range, the 2,500 years ago or more. So there was just more variety. I just see these giant creatures, giant dragonflies, giant sloths, saber-toothed tigers, dinosaurs, as an enormous variety that have since went extinct. One of the problems the early creationists had in the 1800s when this idea of evolution was being developed, they had this mindset that God is perfect, which is true. Therefore, God will never allow anything to go extinct, which is an assumption that's not biblical. Therefore, every creature we see alive has to be identical to some creatures that used to be alive in the past. Well, the geologists started digging up these bones of creatures that were nothing like things that were alive today, and they started lining them up into sequences. Like you could line a tricycle and a bicycle and a motorcycle and a car into a sequence and say, see, one turned into another. Well, that's what you can do with bones, too. The creationists started fighting that and saying, no, those things never existed that they were finding in the rocks. And they lost credibility with the scientific community. And then their whole framework of beliefs in the Bible deteriorated, while the other framework of belief that one kind of animal's turned into another, that's turned into another, turned into another, and was popularized by Charles Darwin, was accepted. Because they added to God's word instead of accepting what it had to say. Yes?
Do you believe, Bruce, that outside of the Garden of Eden, back in the beginning, you mentioned instantaneous generation, or revitalization Adam and Eve?
It's speculation, but go ahead.
Outside the Garden of Eden, do you believe that there were creatures or life forms that also had this regeneration?
Okay, I'm going to speculate again, but it's going to fit Scripture what I'm speculating. The question was, outside of the Garden of Eden, do you think things live forever and there was instant regeneration? I believe what God was describing as the Garden of Eden was the earth, was the entire earth. The worldwide flood was that second step change. It totally reshaped the continents, the land masses, laid down the coal, laid down the fossil record. When we read in the Bible that certain rivers were in the Garden of Eden and we still find those rivers today, I think they were named after what were the original rivers. I think the entire creation was perfect and there was not death. Now, were there plants dying? Yes, because we were told to eat plants. Were microorganisms living and dying? I don't know, probably. There's several places where God said He breathed the breath of life into living things, and life is in the blood. So maybe God's definition of things that live forever are those things that have a respiratory system and a central circulation system. And some sort of microbes and insects and plants don't fit that definition of God as life. And those were living and dying. Don't know. That's where you get into speculation. But I think the Garden of Eden was the earth, was the whole earth. And Adam and Eve were told to go multiply and fill the earth. And I think that meant the whole Garden of Eden. And it did disappear after the flood. So there's probably lots of theological arguments that can go on there, but that's my viewpoint. So
I think we'll
go
have
ahead.
to end the formal questioning, and you'll stay here for a while.
Sure. Yeah, I'm around for whatever we'd like to talk about.
Clarification too on the.
Yes.
If you find 40,000 year date for carbon dating, that's assuming that there's the same amount of carbon-14 originally. And of course,
Correct.
There's good evidence that
Correct.
pre-flood there was much less carbon-14. They started out with a tiny fraction because of the Earth's dynamic.
Yeah, and I get into that into the DVD on dating, that carbon dating gives the wrong date because there was a shift, a step change in the amount of carbon being spread throughout the organisms in the Earth. So, yep. So just come on down here and come on down here and we'll talk. Thank you.
Just a quick, serious
Yes.
point. But,
Yeah.
I hear a lot of people say Christianity is a worldview, and I know what they mean. But
Yeah,
I really
I
think
hope.
the